basically, just for the sake of recording, I'm sharing that what we're going through is we did in class the lymphatic system, and this morning on these virtual classes, I went through both the lymphatic system and immune system. But since everyone in attendance on this class tonight has gone through the lymphatic system already, what I'm going to do, I'm simply going to go through the immune system, but we'll take it as a chance to also look through this week's lab, which is what we would be completing tomorrow afternoon together in a class. So in terms of the handout for the immune system, the two big terms to be familiar are antigen and antibodies. Antigens are the foreign invaders, something that shouldn't be there in the body, and antibodies are then what detect that and act on that. Other term that you might sometimes hear being used is the immunoglobulin when we talk about antibodies. And these all should be familiar to you from when we discussed about the red blood cells and blood typing. Well, immune system can be divided into two parts. The first part that we're looking at is the innate immune system, and that's really general responses. They're not specific about any particular type of pathogen that might come into your body, any particular type of antibody. They just act on everything. So it's really kind of a blanket response to something that shouldn't be in your body. And these work through 3 different levels that I've listed here. So I listed 2 levels, it could be 3 levels, however you wish, but through different lines of defense. So first of all, we try to keep the pathogen from getting into your body by having physical barriers. We're covered with skin, we have mucous membranes for any other body surfaces that would be open to the world, and so on. Certain fluids try to form a barrier, like in terms of our eyes, so not everything can get through into our body through our eyes. The second way how we deal with these pathogens in innate immune system is by using chemicals. If you get through, say, a cut through the skin, the pathogen gets into our body, then we try to have another chemical way of stopping them. And that's often things like sweat. Sweat kills a lot of bacteria, viruses, various things like stomach acid. If you eat something that you shouldn't do, those chemicals kill those. In our eyes, we have tears are really good at killing a lot of bacteria, because eyes are one of the easiest ways for pathogens to get into our body. So sort of chemical reactions to stop stuff from getting into our body. And the last response would be cell responses. So we actually recruit the immune system cells to fight what shouldn't be. The other branch is adaptive immune system. So this is what we think when we think of someone having become immune to something. They're very specific against certain pathogens. And really, it's the T cells and B cells that are the workforce of this branch. So it's a little bit more nitty-gritty details. It's not these general responses that we just talked about. I do want to mention here that another way how sometimes the immune system can be divided, it can be divided into humoral immunity, which refers that it's antibodies that act on that. Or it can be cell-mediated immunity, where we don't need the antibodies, but that's activated in response to the antigen. Another important thing that I have here for inflammation signs and symptoms is 4 signs and symptoms. I would add 5th one on those. So if you have inflammation somewhere, that site often feels warm. That's because there's a lot of blood flowing to that side. It also looks red. Well, we can see that blood through the skin on that side. The reason why we want a lot of blood coming into there is that we want to carry as many white blood cells there as we possibly can. So since we're packing that with new blood, new white blood cells and so on, that's likely to get swollen, that area as well. And simply because it's swollen, but also to stop us from using that injured site, it becomes very sore. The 5th one that I don't have listed there, that I'm definitely going to change next year when I do this again, I'm going to add also loss of function. So if you have an inflammation, say on your leg, for example, on your toes, you probably are going to want to avoid stepping on that. It's going to hurt. So it's that being sore, but also the loss of function. That serves twofold purpose. It serves the purpose that we don't use something that should be focusing on just getting better, but also if it's sore, if there's an inflammation, it might be that food doesn't carry us as well as it would normally. So it gives up underneath of us away. So that's why the loss of function is the fifth one. In terms of this handout is really short because I had very little to say. In terms of rest of the chapter, we talk about allergies, transplants, autoimmune diseases, things like that. We won't go into too much of a detail, but I want you to know that all of these relate to the immune system. I try to include on these handouts sometimes thinking what happens when you get older. And some of the biggest changes are in immune system that your thymus shrinks. You also get a greater risk of developing various infections and cancers. So it has nothing to do that you're not taking care of yourself, just simply because you're older. Those errors, for example, to the cell replication process can end up building up. Also, your responses to things in body, changes in body, become slower. And final point, and this is not to diss old people, but older people sometimes cannot handle as rough treatments as we would give to younger people. So we have to kind of balance it off, that are we gonna give a treatment that can be fatal to the patient, even though it's gonna save them from that condition, but they feel too weak afterwards. And then I drew a really nice picture because I had nothing else to do of immune system cell recognizing a pathogen and being that, oh, this cell shouldn't be there, it must be destroyed. So that's really all there was on a review sheet for this chapter. And hi, Stephanie, thank you for joining us. Really what we were just doing, we were looking through the review sheet for the chapter on the immune system. So we will go through this review sheet tomorrow as well, but in case you choose not to come, I wanted to give you a chance, since you're here, to get a chance to make notes of that. So I'll just go to the beginning, and while I'm talking about a few other things, you have a chance to take notes of those. The other thing that we also decided to do is that we're probably not going to go through the lymphatic system chapter material again, since we already went through that during our Tuesday class. I have to think of the weekdays of the week. It goes so fast. So during our Tuesday class, we went through the lymphatic system. We did not go through the immune system. So what I was going to do, I was going to go through the chapter material of the immune system, just really briefly. And we're going to also look at the virtual lab a little bit, because that's what we're doing tomorrow. Of course, I love it if you want to join me and you want to hang out with us, but it is a lab that you can do completely independently as well. And to be able to do it completely independently, I just want to make sure if you do it independently, you have all the answers. So I prepared a little PowerPoint for that as well. And having said all that, I'm just scrolling the last part of the handout that I didn't show yet. And let me just, once you've had a chance to look at those, let me just jump to talk about the immune system and most important points about the immune system that you need to. If you really want to hear about the lymphatic system again, I did go through that this morning when I made a recording of that. So that's also available on Canvas. So if you have had a chance to get the answers to this, I'm going to stop sharing this screen and jump into a different screen so we can just make a move. But as always, if at any time you have any questions, do not hesitate just to speak up. Sometimes I don't notice the chat. I try to monitor the chat, but sometimes I don't notice. So don't feel that I'm ignoring you if I'm not answering there. Just unmute yourself. So what do you need to know about the immune system? Immune system is kind of a physiological system that doesn't have really anatomical structures. It lives within the anatomical structures of the lymphatic system. So that's what makes it a little bit weird or a little bit more complex when students try to think about it, because there's very little concrete things we can pick. But the main function of this system is to find these pathogens. The word pathos, I think in Latin, refers to some sort of an invading organism that shouldn't be in your body. And there's many different kinds of pathogens. It can be bacteria, it can be viruses, it can even be parasites. So many different things that shouldn't be in our body that can end up in our body. And it's the job of the immune system to deal with those. And it's especially the white blood cells. I'm not going to remove all the highlights that I did this morning, so you'll just see what I've already highlighted. It's nothing too different. So really the big thing for remembering the immune system, it's kind of now a physiological system that relies on the lymphatic system and a little bit also on our blood and cardiovascular system, because it's the white blood cells here that are going to be important. The immune system can be divided into two branches. So if you had a chance to see that handout that we just went through, this will ring bells. So we have two branches for the immune system. The first branch is going to be innate immunity. That's all about non-specific responses. So this branch of immune system deals with anything at all, any kind of pathogen. But these responses are very general, so they're not really targeted. So even though they can deal with anything, which is great, they're not as targeted responses. The second branch that we are going to have a look of is going to be adaptive immune system. And adaptive is the term that American textbooks like to use. I studied most of my studies in UK, and the term that we use there is acquired to describe this branch of immune system or immunity in general. And I think acquired sounds to me like it makes a little more sense describing what it is. It is something that is developed only as a response once you've met a pathogen, you've developed a plan on how to deal with it, and then you meet it for the second time. Now you have acquired an immunity against it. So it's very specific, very targeted, and it's very effective. But it's all of these things only once it has met that pathogen before. So those are the two branches that we are going to talk about the immune system a little bit. So we're going to start with the innate immunity. And innate immunity works through different lines of defense. So there's kind of multiple ways how we try to prevent ourselves from getting sick. The first line of defense would be to have physical barriers. So let's not let the pathogen get into our body at all. And if we're able to keep the pathogen out from our body, we're going to be fine. So it's all about building these physical barriers. For example, skin is one of the biggest physical barriers that we have in the body. I often compare this in my class to the students like thinking medieval fortresses, castles. It's this wall of this fortress, the outermost wall, that would be analogous to the physical barriers of the innate immunity. So we're really trying to block the pathogen from getting in. If you have a cut in the skin, well, that is a risk because there's a direct route now for a pathogen to get into your body and especially to your circulation. But it's not only the skin that's the only barrier. When you look into the nasal cavity, into the mouth, or any other orifices that we have, what you end up noticing is that it's not skin that's lining that surface, it's mucous membrane that lines that surface. So that's just a different kind of barrier. These barriers are not as thick and not as dry as skin, but they're barriers again, keeping things away from getting inside our body. So that's the first line of defense. Sometimes that fails. So what we do if that fails, we recruit then the second line of defenses, which is to use chemicals, that pathogen might not now have gotten through our physical barriers, but let's use chemicals to kill that pathogen. Sweat on the skin is really good at killing many bacteria, many viruses. Tears that cover our eyes, stomach acid. We talked earlier on that if you eat stuff, we end up eating all the time stuff that we shouldn't be eating. If it would be a risk to our body, the place where it's definitely going to die is by the time it gets to the stomach and stomach acids. That kills pretty much everything. The other example of the chemicals that help to protect our body is if we think of our urethra. Male urethra is much longer than female urethra. And because the female urethra is shorter, there's a shorter way that the bacteria needs to make up there to cause an UTI. So females are more likely to get UTIs. However, a lot of the time, if there has been a situation where there would be a risk that bacteria would have gone up the urethra, let's say during sexual intercourse or after that, we get a need to rinse that. You get a need to urinate. That's kind of washing away the bacteria from the urethra. So another example of this chemical line of defense. Pee urine is sterile on its own, so it's very clean. So we use that to rinse away the bacteria that shouldn't be there. So that was what I meant with the second line of barriers or chemical barriers. We do have also a chance to recruit cells as a third line of defense, if you wish, to deal with what shouldn't get through. If we get through the physical barriers and chemical barriers, then we recruit cells to deal with those pathogens that shouldn't have gotten. So that's our kind of order of how we're dealing with things that shouldn't. So those are the innate defense system, innate immunities. Main points that I wanted to make. I do want to talk a little bit about inflammation. So whenever we have inflammation, inflammation is a response to an injury. So you have some kind of an injury, and as a response to that, an inflammation develops. And there's 4 or 5 signs and symptoms of acute inflammation. I said that I had listed only 4 on that handout that I gave to you to fill, but I definitely will change it and add the 5th one. So it depends a little bit who you ask from, but I think the 5th one fits in there quite nicely. So if we look at this pictures that we have about inflamed sites, we can see all of those signs and symptoms. We just need to pay a little bit of attention. First of all, we see that the site that's inflamed is typically red in color. That's because we're bringing a lot of blood to that site. The reason why we bring a lot of blood is that we want to really get a lot of those white blood cells to deal with those pathogens on that side. So the redness is the color. If you don't have any blood underneath your skin, you look white, really. All the blood can run out of your face, for example. So you look really pale. So that kind of a nice reddish tone that we see on the skin is due to the blood showing through the skin. Well, if you have a lot more blood flowing there, it starts looking more red than this kind of a normal skin color that we're used. The same thing is also to be seen with the heat. Blood comes typically from the core organs, so the very vital organs of our body. So it's a little higher body temperature in there. So if that blood is coming from that site in great quantities, the temperature on that site that's inflamed locally will also start to climb up. It becomes a little warmer, that site. So if you've ever had an inflammation, you can actually feel it on that site yourself. We talked about how a lot more blood is being directed here to this side. Well, there's more stuff, and there's more other stuff as well than just blood that's going to that side. But that all causes that it's packed with material. So that location tends to swell. So there's swelling at inflamed sites. I think these toes here show it really nicely, especially if we compare these toes to this toe that's not as inflamed as they are. Of course, inflamed sites are really painful. You don't want to really touch them. You don't want to use them. And that makes sense because there's so much going on. So first of all, we want to let that site to recover so we don't actually irritate it more. So it kind of stops us from using, which is the fifth sign and symptom. It stops us from using that site. But in addition as well, that site might not do its job as well as it normally would. So it kind of protects us also in that sense that, okay, it's not going to probably work really well and it's really sore. So let's protect us from actually using that part of it. So those are the 5 signs and symptoms of inflammation. And I often ask my students that, is inflammation good for you? Is it something you want to happen? And it really does a lot of good for the purposes that it has. It stops the inflammation stops the damage from spreading from that site elsewhere. So let's say we have inflammation because pathogens got to that site. Well, if it's now all busy and packed up with stuff, probably the root cause is not going to spread to other parts of the body. We're dealing with it. We're also removing all these pathogens at the site of inflammation. Remember the rich amount of white blood cells that flows in there now with the rest of the blood. This is also a great in that it alerts rest of the immune system that something's happening that we need to deal. We talked about how you can feel that there's inflammation going on by feeling the lymph nodes. So we know that the entire body is now on alert, even though the inflammation might be local. And of course, these conditions, a little warmer temperature, a lot of white blood cells available, rich blood circulation there, all of these things are ideal for repair of the tissues. So they also help with the tissue repair. So inflammation in that sense is really beneficial for us. And that brings me to talk about another thing. Yes, ask.
So if inflammation is good, why is that always the first thing that you want to treat when someone like gets hurt?
That is such a good question. And actually on the morning class, I was kind of saying that I think we tend to give medications to get rid of inflammation immediately, almost a little too easily. Like we're like, oh, you should never feel any signs and symptoms of inflammation. You should be totally fine. I'm not saying you should be miserable. We don't want patients to feel bad, but we might be over medicating a little bit. So sometimes that might be a reason why we don't recover as fast as we could. So this is something where there's a little bit of room for that ethics and your views, where you develop your professional identity. Do you believe that patients should ever feel any discomfort? If you don't feel that they should feel ever any discomfort, you probably are going to try to get rid of that inflammation immediately. If you feel that, okay, little discomfort is okay, if it helps us to do all these 4 things that we listed, you might be, okay, we're going to let you feel a little bit of this because it's going to help you, but we're not going to let you feel so much that you feel miserable. So that's a really good question. And I think it shows that you're thinking like a doctor already. So you're asking all those questions. So really what we end up finding when you go to the med school or nursing school is that life isn't as black and white as the textbooks tell you. You're sick, you take a pill, you get better. Sometimes you have to choose, is it okay to be a little sick? I don't know if that really answered, but that was my best way of trying to dance around with that topic.
Yeah, it kind of helped.
Okay, good. And that was a really good question. I really do think that there's no textbook answer to that we can say that you definitely should never have any signs and symptoms of inflammation, or that we all should be suffering with inflammation. So it's a little bit, once you get to the point where you're in a position to prescribe medicines, you do the best judgment that you feel is the right judgment. That brings us to talk about fever. So I'm really glad you brought that up. So another thing that's often associated is abnormally high body temperature. So we talk about you having abnormally high body temperature when it's even just a little bit above what it normally would. I come from the metric system and Celsius system. So I'm going to now use Celsius scale. You can convert it. There's a lot of good apps on the Google and so on if you're confused. But we don't want you to go crazy with fever. If you get too high of a fever, that will have bad consequences for the patient. At about 40 degrees of Celsius, when your temperature gets there, enzymes start to get destroyed. And we know we needed a lot of enzymes in our body to do various different kinds of things. So at that point, regardless whether we believe that having a little fever is good or bad for you, at that point, we do want to deal with that fever. We don't want enzymes start and other molecules starting to break down in your body. That's simply not good. However, this is again one of those discussions that you would ask that, well, when you get sick, we usually try to get you out of from having fever. Some people say that maybe having a little fever might actually be useful, that you recover quicker. So again, it depends who you ask from. So let's have a look at some of the positive signs or sides of having a fever. So fever stops a lot of the microbial growth because the temperature is now a little higher. It's no longer ideal for those microbes to grow. They still grow, but they don't grow as well. Also, metabolism refers to any chemical reaction that takes place in your body. Well, if we increase temperature, these chemical reactions take place at a higher rate. And if these are beneficial chemical reactions, as in case of dealing with some sort of an illness, it might be beneficial that they are taking place a little faster. Also, with the fever comes that phagocytosis. So you remember eating those pathogens that shouldn't get into your body, the white blood cells that are phagocytotic cells, they eat those and then break them inside that cell into small components that are no longer dangerous to you. That process gets also increased when we have a little bit higher body temperature than normal. So it almost looks like having some fever might be beneficial for getting over that being unwell. Again, there's a limit. We don't want you to go crazy and be super uncomfortable, and especially we don't want molecules to start to break in your body. There is a group of people who believe in generating artificial fever for yourself every now and then. And that group of people is my native folks who invented sauna. If you go to sauna, you basically make your body trick that they think your body thinks that, oh, I'm having a fever. And you get all of these beneficial results of a fever. However, we don't live in the sauna, so we get out of there eventually. But some people swear by generating artificial fever for remaining healthy and maintaining your health. So kind of the same thing that you just brought up earlier on. I think that you're thinking very good questions and you're asking all the right questions. So that's all I was going to say about the innate immunity. I am going to talk a little bit about the adaptive immunity, but we're not going to go into great detail of that because that really, I have friends who have studied years and years of that in the university and still say that we don't fully get it. So we're keeping it simple. So the adaptive immunity was this acquired branch, a very specific. We get a really strong response, very effective response, and it's only a response for that particular pathogen. But the downside of that was that we had to meet that pathogen before. So it's like second time of getting sick. So this operates through B cells and T cells, and we've already touched upon them a little bit on our previous classes. So I'm going to leave it to that level of detail on this review. If you're really passionate about B cells and T cells, there is more detail of them on the actual lecture video, but I'm not expecting at the end of this course for you to be experts of those. So I said earlier on that adaptive immunity was very specific. So if there's a pathogen, it deals with only that kind of a pathogen. It's really good about that. And these responses take throughout the place, throughout your entire body. So it's systemic in that sense as well. The downside is that you need to prime the adaptive immunity before it's going to work. So you must have met that pathogen once before. dealt with it and developed an immunological memory against that pathogen type. So it's only good for the second time, not for the first time that you meet the pathogen. There's two branches to the adaptive immunity, cell-mediated and humoral. I'm not going to go to those. I've uploaded this picture as a handout onto your Canvas shell. It's kind of more of if you're interested to know what's the difference between B cells and T cells. It talks about that and also the overlap between the two a little. But I do want to make sure that you're comfortable, and we've already talked about this when we talked about the blood transfusions and blood types. You should be comfortable with what is an antigen and what is an antibody. So antigens were these foreign pathogens, and pathogen is just a general term for anything that invades your body, comes to your body, is not part of your body, that's not good for you. So it's this foreign pathogen invader in your body that shouldn't be. We also have antibodies. Antibodies are these elements that recognize these pathogens and act on these pathogens. And those are often known as immunoglobulins or abbreviated as IG when we write a lot of notes about them and when we talk about different types of antibodies. So if you go into the field of immunology, you might end up learning a lot of different kinds of immunoglobulins. The reason why I've drawn them out here is that I wanted to really try to illustrate that antigen and antibody must always be a match. It's like this key and lock mechanism. They need to be a match. Not every antibody will work on every antigen. They need to be a pair. Other thing that I've shown here is that often we draw antibodies as these kind of Y-shaped structures on textbooks. That's because it's the simplest way of illustrating the antibody, but it certainly isn't the only way of illustrating antibodies. There are other types of antibodies. I've shown some of them here. I would not expect you to be able to identify them based on their appearance. That's for the university level stuff that you'll be learning. I have mentioned the B cells and T cells earlier on. You remember that it was all about where they go to mature these cell types. But what I want to focus on are these APCs, antigen presenting cells. These are like little helpers of the adaptive immune system. They don't really work like B cells or T cells. They just assist the B cells and T cells to work. And they do exactly what the name proposes. So antigen presenting cells, whenever there's an antigen that they find, they can't get rid of that antigen themselves, but they make a big song and dance about the fact that rest of the immune system can then find it and deal with it. So they really present this antigen to the rest of the immune system. And there's many different types of these dendritic cells, macrophages, certain B cells as well, and so on. So you don't need to know anything else than that the antigen presenting cells, they can't act on these pathogens themselves, but they draw immune systems, rest of the immune system, its attention to these pathogens. So they kind of are assistants, helpers. What I do want to talk real quickly when we think of this immunological memory that's specific for this specific adaptive branch of immunity, I want to talk what happens when you meet the pathogen for the first time and what happens when you meet it for the second. Well, the first encounter, it takes longer for you to get any kind of response. It takes days for you to get a response for that to that pathogen. And the level of response, the amount of immunoglobulins that we produce, so antibodies, the amount of those that we produce is quite small, really. Enough to deal with it, but you feel sick for a while. If we compare this to the secondary immune reactions, when you meet that same antigen again at the later time, what we'll notice that this secondary response is super fast. Within hours, we get a response, and this response is hugely stronger than what we saw in this primary response. This is because we have now developed memory cells, and it's these memory cells that can last weeks, months, even years. And we can generate these memory cells either by getting sick or by giving vaccinations. So that's why with this COVID, for example, we were like, if you've had a COVID, you're probably going to be fine for a while because you now have immunological memory against COVID. Or if you haven't had a COVID, let's give you vaccination that you develop this immunological memory, these memory cells against the secondary or against this particular pathogen. And I think easier way to think of this is by seeing it in action. So what we're seeing here, and because I've drawn so much on this, I'm going to add one more pen so it becomes a little more obvious. What we're seeing first of all, the first exposure. The first exposure takes place during day 0, but you'll notice it takes many days, I would say maybe 5 days, before you actually see a response to this pathogen. And the response, yes, this is a logarithmic scale, so it is quite a high response, but it's not the strongest response to this pathogen, but enough to deal with that you don't get sick. So that's what happens if you have never met that pathogen before. Let's have a look what happens if you have met it before, and this is now the memory cells that help us to deal with it. You get the response almost immediately after you're exposed to it, you see. Rather than within days, it's within hours that we get that response. And that response is hugely stronger than anything you've seen before. And it also sticks around this response, these immunoglobulins, much longer in your body. So that really explains why it is at the specific adaptive immune system that it's the second exposure when it can actually really work. It doesn't really do that much good during the first exposure. During the first exposure, it is likely that your innate immunity deals with it before the adaptive specific immunity gets around to it. Yes?
So if it could stay, like let's say like the second time you got it, and like you said, it can stay in your body like for weeks to months,
even years. Yeah.
What's it called? So how do they know with vaccines how long it stays?
Well, normally most vaccines it stays years, but you might need to get a booster shot every now and then. And what we do, we like kind of give you the third exposure without you getting sick and bring up the amount of immunoglobulins for that. Think of, for example, flu vaccines. We know that flu vaccines are good for 1 year, and they give you a little bit of protection on the second year as well, because there are still some of those immunoglobulins, but by the time you get to the third year, most likely there's nothing left. So it's just that we have done enough research. We know those illness, how those sicknesses proceed well enough that we know that for certain secondary responses, it can be years that they say around. For some, it can be only months, it can be only weeks. So it's just a matter of what type of a disease we're talking about. And that's the big thing that we were very nervous when the COVID first broke through, that we were like, oh, is it going to give you an immunity for weeks, months, years? We're seeing that it is a little longer than we thought. But I don't think that we have this. This is my personal view. I'm not talking on behalf of the school, but I don't think we have this figured out. I don't think this one vaccine is going to keep you good for the rest of your life. I think it might be more like a flu vaccine, that we take COVID vaccines every few years. But I don't know any better. The research is still being done. So to answer to your question, that's a good question. We don't know. We really don't have a definite answer. We only know the ones, the illnesses, the sicknesses that we have dealt with before. And those that we have dealt with before, we have a fairly good understanding that how long that secondary immune response antibodies remain in the body. That was a really long answer to say that you're right. We don't, sorry.
No, it's okay.
You'll be glad to hear that we're almost done with the lecture material. I do think, though, when we talk about immune system, we need to talk a little bit about organ transplants. Because really, if the function of the immune system was to deal with something that shouldn't be in your body, the organ transplant is something that shouldn't be in your body. So these are the times when we actually have to bring down your immune system. So if you have a friend who has received an organ transplant, don't go and see them when you're sick, because they're probably not going to, their transplant is going to be fine, but they can't deal with even just a regular cold. Their immune system has been brought down so that they wouldn't reject that organ. You can get organ transplants from the same person. So say if you burn your skin and we have to put skin graft, we can often take it from other side of your body. That's ideal because we don't have any matching issues. It's gonna be, your body is gonna accept it. Unfortunately, most of the time that's not an option. With skin, that's a good option, but most of the time we only have one organ. So if you have to give an organ transplant and you don't have a spare organ from that same individual, well, then we go for another individual from the same species. So another human can donate you an organ. That's probably the most common one. Ideally, it would be your identical twin, but that's not likely to happen. Also, sometimes we just don't get enough these organs from other humans, so we have to look to species that are non-humans. And in this case, we use a lot of, for example, pig heart valves to replace heart valves on humans that don't have heart valves that would work, and so on. So basically, then these individuals end up living rest of their life with a piece of another species inside. It's better than being dead. But to live with any of these so that your body doesn't reject the organ transplant, we really need to knock out your immune system. So you're going to be very vulnerable for many diseases because your immune system is not working. One question that students love to play a game with me, we guess that which ones are the most common transplants. These numbers are a little old, but the ratios are still the same, even though the numbers might be a little different from year to another. What are the most common organ transplants that we do? Well, kidneys and livers are at the top of the list because we have two kidneys. You have a spare kidney, it's easy to get kidneys donated. It's not hard to find kidneys. Same with the liver, because liver regenerates really well and really easily. If you donate your liver, you can donate even up to 50% of your liver. And in a year from donating it, your liver will have grown back to the size it was before, and that will be fairly functional as it was even before. So it's easy to get kidneys and livers for transplants. That's why they're very common transplants to do. However, hearts and lungs are certainly much harder to come by, but it kind of is that you can't live without a heart or a lung. You kind of need to have those. So that's why they take the places 3 and 4 on the organ transplant list, because you really just need those. So I hope that that makes sense, that why we see certain more common than others. One interesting question to ask is that, well, how good, how successful are organ transplants then? Well, it turns out that initially very successful, but by the time we get to the 10 years, about 50% of the organ transplants have failed. So either these individuals have to go through another transplant, or unfortunately, we lose also a lot of transplant patients. You do notice, though, that there is some differences between what we are transplanting. Kidneys are highly successful, lungs less so. Initially, couple of first years, most of them are successful, but it's within the time that we start to see this difference. Really, like I said, the big problem with organ transplants is that for organ transplant not to fail, you need to knock out, turn off the rest of your natural immune system. So I really like this quote that's from one of the medical textbooks that I used to use, that the good news is that we managed to save your life, but the bad news is that you're going to have to spend paying for it for the rest of your life. So I don't know. I hope I'm not too gloomy today. I had a bunch of slides to talk about, well, when your immune system goes wrong, when there's issues with it. I'm not asking you to know these by heart. I'm just so that you kind of can appreciate that sometimes certain conditions impair function or production of immune system cells. There's issues. Hodgkin's disease is a cancer of B cells. AIDS, HIV really deals with those helper T cells. There's issues with them, but you normally don't die out of AIDS, HIV. You die due to the secondary infections that come. So that goes to show again that the immune system, once that gets weakened, then you are likely to get even normal cold can be fatal for you. I have some other examples here about autoimmune diseases. When your immune system loses ability to tell itself from rest of your body, rheumatoid arthritis, myasthenia gravis, MS, Graves' disease, type 1 diabetes, lupus, and so on. So really, you didn't miss a lot. We were just talking about, thanks for coming back. I know that the internet has been weird. You didn't miss a lot. We were just talking about organ transplants and how to have an organ transplant. For that to survive, we normally need to turn off your normal immune system, and how that makes you so risky to die out of just a regular cold. We also talked about the fact that organ transplants don't really survive that well long term. In about 10 years, 50% of organ transplants fail. That's pretty sad. But certain transplants work better than others. And then I just started talking that, oh, we have certain conditions that affect us that relate to the immune system, but I'm not expecting you to be experts of that. Sometimes also our immune system can run like super crazy, like when you have allergies. It is a harmless thing, but your body thinks that, oh, this is a huge pathogen and we're going to have to deal with it. And allergies can have huge reactions that result from those, even though it shouldn't. Your immune system is just like almost too good or almost running on too fast. Same for when you go to anaphylactic shock. Your body generates over-the-top response to something that shouldn't be a big deal at all. And that really covers everything that I had about the immune system. Did you have any questions about anything that we've talked about so far? You've asked some really good questions. I'm really impressed. You two are going to go to places, trust me.
I don't have any.
If you don't have questions, if you don't mind, just because I promised, I am going to show what we're going to do in the lab tomorrow. The lab worksheet is there on the canvas. And also the lab simulation, you can do it from home if you want. Not to say that I don't like you guys. I'm going to be there and you're welcome to come. But I know that sometimes in life you have to choose what you spend your time on. I've been a student. I know that my class is not the only thing in your life. Just make sure that you do the lab and you're able to submit it in. So that's the reason why I'm going to show the lab, but it's not to say that do not come to the class, and it's not to say that you have to do it at home. And if you have to go to do something else, don't feel that you have to stick around. I just promised to do that, so I want to follow through with that promise. It won't take long at all. So I'm going to share another PowerPoint. This is the PowerPoint that we're using tomorrow to talk about herd immunity. So all lab is going to be about herd immunity. And before I go into that, I just don't want to say to you that I have all the answers. I believe that I understand that some people trust in vaccines and some people don't. I have my own beliefs, and I'm not going to try to convert you to believe anything that you don't believe. So I believe that everyone should be respected to have a freedom of making the choice that they do, even though I don't have to agree with your choice. So I'm not going to convert you, and I hope you're not going to try to convert me. So I will respect your right to be wrong, provided that you respect my right to believe that you're wrong. I'm not going to rub it on your face, but that's a really, I just love good memes. That's what I live. So what we're going to be talking about is different kinds of ways of dealing with diseases and being protected. So it's all to do with the immunity. We have two branches for immunity, direct immunity and indirect immunity. Direct immunity, when we have been previously exposed to something, example of that would be these memory cells that we develop against pathogens that we have faced. So you've been sick before, and now you have acquired an immunity against that sickness. That would be an example of direct immunity due to previous exposure to that disease. So you've developed a memory against that pathogen. We can also help you to build that memory by giving you a little bit of that pathogen, but we have made that pathogen pretty weak, or we have only given you a section of that pathogen, or it's unfunctional. These are all different kinds of vaccines that we have. So not all vaccines are alike. Some of them are live virus. Some of them are dead. Some of them are only part of that virus. Some of them are weakened forms of that virus. So there's many different kinds of vaccines, but vaccination is one way to give you direct protection against immunity without you having to get sick. The indirect ways of how you can get an immunity is, for example, newborns. When you're born as a baby, you actually have a lot of antibodies in your blood. You have never been sick, but you have these antibodies. That's because you received them from your mother. However, those maternal antibodies wear off over time. Like you saw that curve that we just talked, that how long are those antibodies going to stick around? Well, if there's nothing to make those antibodies and you got them from your mother, they're not going to stick around forever. And this is where our vaccination program that we say that newborns should be vaccinated at these months, it comes from, that we know how long those antibodies are going to stick around from the maternal blood. The one that we're going to be looking on this lab is indirect immunity through herd immunity. So what herd immunity refers to, that we have high enough percentage of the population that has either gotten sick or that has gotten vaccinated, so that they now have a memory against that pathogen. So there's less chances for the sick people and non-immune people to meet each other when enough of the population has become immunized against that pathogen. That might have sounded like a really difficult way of explaining it, so I'm going to explain herd immunity again in a little bit better way. So herd immunity refers to populations where we have high enough rate of individuals that are protected against that pathogen. Those populations in general, even if you don't have protection against that pathogen, and you live in a population where everyone else is protected, you're likely to stay healthy and safe as well. So really the goal is to accomplish that enough of that population is either vaccinated or has had a previous encounter with that infection, so that when enough people are healthy, few sick people here and there, they're not going to get rest of the population sick. So it is a form of indirect protection. It reduces the likelihood of infection of those individuals who do not have immunity. Yes?
Since it kind of keeps grouping like vaccination and previous infected people as like similar antibodies, do they consider people who have already had the disease, like their antibodies just as strong as people with vaccinations?
Absolutely, probably even stronger. So this previous exposure, even better. The thing is that it just sucks because you probably got really sick.
Mm-hmm.
With vaccination, you might not need to get that sick.
Oh, okay.
Definitely. We were talking about when the COVID first started, could we take the memory cells from individuals that got sick and give them to these individuals that haven't gotten sick yet, like transfer element of the blood.
Can you do that?
Really, probably, but we never really got quite far with that because we found out that vaccines were a quicker and easier way to do it. But it is likely that it would be an option. So we just never really got off too far with that. I prefer, that was a really good question. I prefer to think of herd immunity with a picture. because to me it's hard to when there's a lot of words. I'm not a native English speaker. I'm just like a word after word. I don't know. So in this picture, we have a population. If you're a blue person, you have been vaccinated against something. If you're one of these white people here, you are still part of that population, but you have not been vaccinated against it. You notice some of them are too young to get vaccinations, or some of them might have other reasons why they have not gotten vaccinated. It might be religious belief. It might be that they're going through chemotherapy. They're immunocompromised. So there's always going to be some people in the population who will not get vaccinated. It's unrealistic to think that we're going to get 100% of everyone vaccinated. But if most of the people are vaccinated, this sick person that comes along, it's not going to get in contact with these unvaccinated individuals. So this is how the herd immunity protects also these ones that never got a protection against this pathogen. So I think that that's an easier way, at least for me, to get my head around with what herd immunity is. That we're really protecting the ones who have not received protection against that pathogen. And we're almost like by numbers keeping that sick person away from getting in touch with us. This is what we were doing when we were doing social isolation. We were all staying in our homes. Only the ones who had been vaccinated were allowed to return back to the society. So that's basically why world went crazy last 2 years ago already now. The question that I think would be fair to ask is that, well, why don't we get everyone vaccinated? Why can't we get everyone vaccinated? If we get as many people vaccinated as possible, we're going to be better off. Absolutely. But some people might be sick at that time. They're too sick to deal with another vaccine. They just cannot handle it. Or, like I said, they might have a compromised immune system. Say they got an organ transplant. They cannot deal with another immunization. Or they're going through chemo, like I said. It might be also that some people make a personal choice. Their belief system, for example, religious reasons, tell that they cannot get vaccinated. Or they don't trust science. They're skeptic about science. All of those would be reasons. I'm not saying whether they're good or bad reasons, but I think I have to respect your beliefs. It's that if that's what you believe in, I can't force you to take a vaccine. That's where I stand, but people have different views. So that's where many students are like, well, why don't we just vaccinate everyone? We try, but we never will be successful. But when enough of the population has the immunity, everyone has a lesser of a chance of getting infected. Also, those poor ones who did not have a chance, they did not get to choose not to take vaccine. And it would suck if those who did not get to take a vaccine have to live socially isolated for the rest of their life due to pandemic, due to COVID. So you're basically, by taking a vaccine, protecting those who cannot protect themselves. So what you're going to be doing on this lab, you're going to go to this website, and it is there on the lab worksheet. It's an simulation software about how does a disease spread through the population if we have certain amount of individuals vaccinated or not vaccinated. So you look at the number of total population that gets infected and how many of the people who are not vaccinated, how many of them will get infected. So we're really doing on a computer the big simulation that we were doing for the past 2 years. You don't have to worry about that address. It's going to be there on the material. So don't feel like, oh, I couldn't write it down. But if you do need me to stop at any point, you just let me know. I'm going to show you what you will see on the screen when you go to that website. You will see a randomly generated population. So each of these circles is a population. Some of them have been vaccinated, so they're green in color. Some of them are unvaccinated, so they're red in color. These green ones are not going to get sick. They're fine. And some of these red ones, they might get sick. Now the issue comes that do all of these red ones come next to each other? That does the infection have a chance to spread from one individual to another? And that's all math. That's probability calculation. So then we are in that simulation going to infect some people, and you get to choose which one of these people you're going to infect. Of course, you cannot infect someone who's been vaccinated. They are protected against it, but you can choose which one of these red dots you end up infecting. And you also choose that how many of those people are going to be green, how many of them are going to be red. So what's the immunization rate of the population? We're going to use, rather than percentages, we're going to use numbers that you'll see in statistics. 0.1 refers to 10%, 0.3 refers to 30%, 0.5 to 50%, 0.7 to 70%, and 0.9 to 90%. How much of the population has been immunized? And then when you do set those numbers, you see on this population where most people were not immunized, most of them were red, how that disease, I clicked it here, how it spreads throughout the population. Some individuals, even though the disease spreads, they'll always be fine because they are vaccinated. Some people, even though they have not been vaccinated, they might not get sick. But if everyone around them gets sick, their chances of getting sick grows up. So that's really what you'll be doing on this lab. And you will be recording the results for the percentage of the people who got sick, who were vaccinated, and how many people got sick who were unvaccinated. And you will run each of these simulations 5 times and then count the average, the mean for those values. And you'll do this for all of these different conditions, 10%, 30%, 50%, 70%, and 90% of the population being vaccinated. So that's really all you're going to be doing on this lab. And once you've collected that data, you fill it into those little tables that I provided. That helps you to answer these questions. I do realize that you haven't had a chance to do the lab, and we're going to look at the answers. But that's where I'm now trying to help you today. So there's 5 questions that I'm asking you to answer. First of all, I'm going to ask you to explain the relationship between immunization rate, so how many people have been vaccinated, and the percentage of population that gets infected. I'm telling you that you should look at your mean values across all of these immunization rates that we talked about. That what does it matter how much of the population has been vaccinated in terms of how many of the people get sick? And what we will end up finding is that, of course, it matters. If you have higher immunization rate, we're going to have less infections. So a higher immunization rate results in lower infection rate. That's the relationship between the immunization rate and percentage of population that gets infected. So that is going to be, honestly, the first question on your lab worksheet. And you can use your own words. You don't have to use the same words as I use. My English isn't always perfect. But the idea should be that if we get a high rate of immunization, like 90%, we are going to have a low rate of infections. The second question asks that how does the percentage of unvaccinated population who are then end up being infected, how does that change as the immunization rate increases? So as more and more people get immunized, how about these who never got immunized and who get sick? What happens to them? Well, as the immunization rate goes up, the percent of unvaccinated that become infected goes down. This is a demonstration of the herd immunity that we just talked about. So if we get most of the people immunized, well, most of the people then will not get sick, of even those who did not get a vaccine. So that's, you can answer as wordy as I've answered here, or you can simply say that, well, that would be a demonstration of herd immunity. Or your pen is giving up.
Yeah, I think it's giving up.
It's the worst thing when you're trying to take notes. Did you get all the answers that you wanted? I don't want you to feel like you're having to rush through because the pen is...
Yeah, I got it.
Okay. Okay, good. The third question that I ask from you is that, is there a point in your data where you will see that the unvaccinated population seems to be protected from the infection? So basically I'm asking that how much of the population should we infect so everyone's going to be fine? And your answers will vary. This is a subjective question. Some students say that it's about half of the population once they get vaccination, then everyone is fine. Some say that it might need to be 70%. It is really up to you how you read the data. So unvaccinated population may become protected from infection at around anywhere between 50 to 70 immunization rate. So I'm not going to say if you give a number 50 that you're wrong. I'm not going to say that you're wrong if it's 40. I'm not going to say that you're wrong if you say that it has to be 90. But it's usually around those numbers. If you say that it has to be 100, then it really doesn't make sense. Or if you say that it's 0, then it doesn't make sense. So what I'm looking is some sort of a reasonable number within this range. So unvaccinated population becomes protected from infections as soon as we have vaccinated about between 50 to 70% of the people. And that 50 to 70 is going to be a key number to keep on mind. Then I'm asking you, well, these extremes that I said, what would happen if the immunization rate was 0? No one has been vaccinated. Or what would happen if the immunization rate is 100? So everyone has been vaccinated. Well, this should make sense. If the immunization rate is 0, everyone will get sick because no one's protected. If no one receives vaccine, everyone will get sick eventually. If everyone has been vaccinated, no one will ever get sick for that disease because everyone's already protected. That's a simple, I think it's a wordy answer from me, but that's a simple of a concept that I'm asking there. That if no one receives vaccine, everyone gets sick. If everyone receives vaccine, no one gets sick. And the last question that I said, remember the number between 50 and 70, is that the newest numbers on how many people have received COVID vaccine in Arizona, this was when I wrote this lab, it was about 45% of people had received vaccine. It might be a little more now, but not much more. So how does it make you feel is a question. And there's no right or wrong answer. You can answer whatever you feel, but tell me something and you'll get points for that. And tell me something that makes a little bit of sense. You can try to reason it. And that's all you have to do on this week's lab. That's the very last question. If you have any questions about the lab, I'm happy to go through that. Now you have the answers to the lab questions. All you have to do is run these simulations that I showed you how you will end up running them. And they're really quite easy and quite quick to do. Do we have any questions about anything at all? Well, that's it, all that I have for today. Remember that you have your quiz, you have your practice anatomy, and then you have this lab. And as long as you get all of those in by the end of the Sunday, you're all set. I also said in the class, and I'm going to say now just as a reminder, that please, please, please remember that if you have missed any assignments or if you want to resit any assignments, I'm happy to do that for you, but you have to ask me to do that to open those up for you. And I probably will not accept those requests for the first part of the semester anymore after next week, because I will have to start adding those zeros. So my bosses are happy. So that's all I have for today. I appreciate that you both joined me. I really do know that you have a lot to do. So I really do value you being here. And I do look at the attendance when I do the final grades as well. Let me just write on the note that you were here. And with that, I have nothing new to say. This is it.
Okay, thank you.
Have a good night. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Enjoy your night. Good luck with the HESIS.
Thank you. I can't figure out how to close this.
Oh, just close all the windows. It will eventually
That's
disappear.
fair.
That's how I do it. Have a good night. Bye. And that completes our recording for this Wednesday evening session. I was glad to see that we had participants, and if you want the full story, you want to hear more about lymphatic system, well, in that case, check out the morning session. But that's it for me. Have a good rest of the evening, and I will see you tomorrow in case you show up to the class. Remember, all I need is 1 attendance per week. But of course, I'm glad to see you there. Have a good night. Thank you. Bye.